Today I'm going to talk about water and sediment control basins and saturated buffers and their impact on water quality. And we're looking at 4 different WASCOBs. 2 of them will have a cover crop on and 2 of them will not have a cover crop. And then we're also looking at 2 ephemeral drains where there is no WASCOB installed and looking at the water quality benefits of those WASCOBs. And on the saturated buffer project, we're looking at a new design. It's called the pitchfork design. And what we're looking at with that is we also added a backflow valve, and with that backflow valve it allows water to go out into the pitchfork but not come back. So what we've seen with our preliminary data so far is that there's actually a reduction in the nutrients being lost and a big reduction in the outflows coming out compared to a side-by-side comparison to a standard saturated buffer.
Thank you. I appreciate the invite to come here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about WASCOBs and saturated buffers. The difference between this project and every other presentation in front of mine is they had multiple years of data. So we're talking like PhD level talks compared to, this is more like a coloring book here. So we're going to see lots of pictures of what we've done this year. We've got a lot of stuff going on at 2 different field sites, so we're going to talk about those. All right, so like Julie mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the PhD folks act like they do all the work, but really it's all these people in the photograph on the right here. We got a lot of researchers involved with these projects. We've got multiple grad students. Actually, my grad students aren't here yet. They're supposed to be putting posters up, and they had to collect water samples this morning before they came. So, like Shalimar said, I probably owe them pizza when we get done with this. But we have 4 different NREC projects going on. We have one with cover crops and tillage, a gypsum impact on yields and water quality, and then the 2 projects I'm going to talk about today are the WASCOB project and then the saturated buffer research. So the first one, I'm not going to bore you with any background information on water quality. We all know the issues with eutrophication. So I'm going to talk about the project up at Menard County. This drains into the Sangamon River. This is a WASCOB project, and I probably passed 10,000 WASCOBs getting here today, maybe or more. The soils are very erodible up there. They're forest soils, much like the soils down in the southern part of the state. So you got more topography, more rolling topography, and more need for these water and sediment control basins. So our objective is to evaluate these in terms of water quality. Like I said, they're ubiquitous across the landscape. There's tons of them out there. They're designed for water and sediment control by name, right? But there's very little evidence in terms of what they do in terms of water quality. So we're going to look at nitrogen and phosphorus and also TSS, or total suspended solids. But we're also going to blend in a layer of looking at cover crops in some of these WASCOB watersheds. So we're going to have a cover crop treatment as well, where we add cereal rye. The soil characteristics, if you're into soils, there's the soil families up there along with the soil series. If you look at the end of the name, you see the ALF. We know those are alpha soils. Those are all what we call timber soils or forest-based soils. So high base saturation, over 35%. They're pretty good in terms of productivity. One thing is they're very erodible soils. These are lust deposits that were blown in. The A horizon is typically pretty shallow. It mixes with the E horizon if you till it. And in the end, they are classified as highly erodible soils. This is a couple of photographs from pre-WASCOB installation. So this is in 2018. There was actually a WASCOB put in along one of the tree lines, but there was a lot of watershed above that WASCOB. So what would happen, a lot of energy coming down, end up blowing or overtopping that watershed, created a concentrated flow path and end up cutting through that watershed, and now you can see the exposed tile down at the bottom of that gully. So the NRCS came in, they designed the WASCOBs for this site. They have multiple different drainages. There's 4 different drainages on this site, all within one farm on about a 40-acre field. They developed the size of the WASCOBs, the tile size, and all the specifications for these sites. These were going to be put in, and the Farm Bureau hooked us up with the landowner and said, hey, we're putting in all these WASCOBs. You want to do some WASCOB research? So we were like, yeah, 4 hours away. What the heck? Let's go. So here we are up in Menard County. Here's a couple more photographs just showing the planning aspect of it, what it looked like on the ground. Like I said, there's some rolling topography here, stuff you'd imagine in a lot of our river bottoms and all the way down to the southern part of the state. So the plan was to get these things installed in the winter time, or over the winter when the soils were frozen and they could get in there. So they hauled in all the equipment, and then if you remember last winter, it was pretty wet. It was pretty wet all the way through the spring, so this equipment sat out there for a long time. The tile plow was a chain-driven plow. There's wheel plows and other types of plows, but this was a chain-driven plow to put the tile line in with. We ended up getting it in the end of June of 2019, so it was pretty wet. We spent a lot of time just looking at the radar and watching this and talking to the contractor that was putting in these tiles, and it took them a little bit to get them in. But in the end, we got them put in. They moved a lot of soil to make these berms, to make the dry dam. And then we also had a field day right after the installation in August to kind of bring in farmers and different constituents to see what was going on that site. So here's the watersheds we're looking at. We were doing a comparison between two on the west side of the map. One in the green is a WASCOB with cover crop. The red one below it is a WASCOB without cover crop. And then we also looked at two ephemeral gullies, which acted as a control to see what would happen if there wasn't a WASCOB. Did water quality change in those situations? Here's a field map just showing what the soil nitrate levels are and the Bray 1 phosphorus concentrations. If you look at the map on the right, a lot of that phosphorus is following the depressional areas or the low spots in the field, so that's where you're seeing your high phosphorus levels. Another thing we're going to do is continue to sample within the WASCOB, because like I said, there was a lot of topsoil moved in those areas, so we want to see what's happening over time as new soil's coming in or sediments coming in and getting laid down in those WASCOBs. So on the ephemeral gully sampling, we put in control structure at the bottom of the watershed. It's called a partial flume, and that's the white bathtub looking thing on the right that shows it basically has a dimension, a known dimension, and based on the water height in that partial flume, we know what the discharge is. So we know how much water is coming through that watershed at all times. On the right side of that partial flume is a stilling well, and that's where the water level is recorded. Each one of those are put in on cinder block foundations that go about 3 or 4 feet in the ground, so we don't have any frost heave. So it took a lot of effort to get these things put in and installed out there. So here's inside that little box, weatherproof box on the right, we have a ISCO automated water sampler. Much like all the other studies you saw, multiple people are using these ISCOs. They have a arm that goes around inside, and you can fill up different bottles, one every hour or 30 minutes, whatever you set it up to. Basically, it's a robotic grad student that we can have out in the field during lightning, rain, tornadoes, whatever. This thing sits out there and does its job, doesn't complain. So like Lowell Gentry said, he had issues with the mice in these things. That's like the least of my worries. And I mean, the mice are bad because they chew up the wires and everything else. But every time we open this lid, red wasps are coming out. It's like you're Jackie Chan all of a sudden because you got all these wasps flying out. So whenever you figure out a solution for that, let me know. So at the outlet for the WASCOBs, they don't have a watershed or a stream that we're sampling. What they have is just a tile outlet. So like a lot of the other studies, we put in a control structure from AgriDrain. It has a little V-notch weir in it. Based on those weir dimensions and the depth of water on top of the weir, we know how much water is coming out that tile outlet at all times. We also have an ISCO on that to pull samples during storm events. So here's the current field conditions. This is after the WASCOBs were installed. A lot of soil was moved. So we've got a student out there that's straddling a little ephemeral gully that's already formed. The WASCOBs are designed to stop erosion in these bigger gullies, but it doesn't really address real erosion in the upper parts of the watershed or sheet erosion. So the farmer will have to fix that with tillage and try to get some type of vegetation on there to slow the water down, get some roots in there to hold that together. So the first couple years after construction on these, and that was the beauty of this project, is we were in at day one. So we can see all this, what's going on, because these things take a little bit of time to kind of settle down, let the soil settle down, and then start functioning like we want them to. So there's just another picture of some of the straw bales that had to be put in to slow that water down. And this is what the bottom of the basin looks like. And this isn't even 1 year into the study. You can see the footprints going through there. A lot of soil's coming out of this watershed and accumulating down in that basin. So a year or two, maybe 3 after the first initial installation, we'll probably have to remove some of that sediment because it's going to start filling up quick. And then hopefully it will stabilize after the soils, like I said, kind of settle down in that area. This is the event mean concentrations of the total suspended solids coming off this watershed. And if you look, the concentrations are relatively low, but the thing that stands out is that Ephemeral Gully is much higher than the 2 WASCOB treatments. So the WASCOBs are settling sediment out, which we expected, and the Ephemeral Gully is exporting more. Same deal with nitrogen and phosphorus. So if you look on the graph on the left, you see the ammonium and nitrate coming off, more nitrate and ammonium coming out of that Ephemeral Gully. The 2 WASCOB watersheds, much lower levels of both ammonium, nitrate, and total P and phosphorus. The samples were actually relatively clean when they came in through the WASCOB. When you pull a sample out of there, it's relatively clean water in terms of clarity anyhow. So we also had these, they're kind of poor man's ISCOs. So instead of buying that $7,000 piece of equipment to set multiple of them up within the watershed, we had these little fence posts with bottles on them, and those bottles have 2 copper tubes coming out of them. The bottom copper tube, once it gets submerged, water starts coming into the bottle, air goes out the top tube, but once the top tube gets submerged, no more water can come in. So you're basically taking a snapshot in time of what that water concentration looks like as water level rises in those WASCOB basins. So when we looked at that data, we got TSS levels that were relatively high in both of those WASCOBs in the upper portion of the WASCOB. Total phosphorus, 5.1 milligrams per liter, 5.7. DRP, the dissolved phase of that is only 0.13 or 0.11. And then nitrate milligrams per liter, relatively low in both of those. Ammonium's also relatively low. The one thing you will notice, the WASCOB 2 is the one with no cover crop. Concentrations tended to be a little higher, but these data are very preliminary. We don't have a whole lot of rain events sampled yet, so we want to sample many more rain events before we make any speculation on whether the cover crop was making a difference or not. So if you look at the WASCOB from a kind of plan view coming down the slope, the upper basins tend to have higher concentrations than what was coming out of the outlet. So that was looking at the stacked pole data in the upper 2 basins. You can see the TSS, nitrate, and DRP were a little bit higher. So there is some kind of microbial processing going on in those upper basins before the water gets down to that outlet. So for the preliminary findings on this research, the ephemeral gullies are contributing more TSS, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Within the WASCOB series, like I just mentioned, there is more nitrogen, phosphorus up at the upper portions of these basins compared to what's coming out at the outlet. So these are all things that we wanted to see. We want to see that these things are functioning as we hoped. And then WASCOBs with the cover crops did have slightly lower concentrations, but like I said, it's kind of early to make any speculation on that, whether that cover crop did make a difference. We're only looking at 1 season so far. So the second study I want to talk about is the saturated buffer research. And this is in Moultrie County by Lake Shelbyville. So y'all are familiar with what a saturated buffer is? Good. So saturated buffers, the objectives of this study are to look at the implementation of a new design. So we have the standard saturated buffer has a control structure. You got water coming in, and then there's 2 diversion lines that divert water laterally into some type of vegetated buffer. This new design is more like a leach field to a septic system. It comes out and then pitchforks and has multiple lines running into the buffer. So instead of going out 500 feet either direction and having a total of 1,000 feet that you're treating, we can have 3 lines going out that same distance. So we can treat 3 times as much water in theory, right? And then we wanted to test a couple different adaptations to that typical standard design. We put on a backflow valve to prevent any flow from coming back from the diversion lines, and then we also added a shutoff valve to the outermost pitchfork so we could shut that water off, not push any more out, so the farmer could get in, dry that part of the field off, and actually plant over that part of the field. So this is kind of what the field looks like in terms of our setup. We are right on the edge of Lake Shelbyville. We were within 300 yards of Shelbyville Lake at this site. So on the west side of the field, we have a 6.5 acre field that's tile drained with pattern tile, comes down to a control structure, and comes into a standard saturated buffer. On the east side of the field's a little bit bigger, watershed area, comes in, and we have the pitchfork running across the south end of the field in 3 tile lines. The chamber for the agri-drain structure, you have an incoming chamber. We got the V-notch weir just like the WASCOB study. We can measure flow coming in, and then it goes to the middle chamber, then goes out to the diversion lines, and then going into the 3rd chamber, there's another V-notch weir, and we can measure outflows. So we got inflows and outflows for those 3 chambers. And like I said, this thing was right on Lake Shelbyville. If you look through the trees right there, that is Lake Shelbyville. That's right, if you're familiar with it, where the West Okaw and Kaskaskia come together. Right there at that confluence is where this study site sits. So the tile installation, we had a little bit different type of tile plow in this situation, but same deal. Put the tile in. It's all on GPS gradient. We can tell exactly what the slopes are. The slope was 0.1% back towards the control structure, so the water would drain back to it. If you have sediment going out, real fine sediment will end up clogging that line. So we have that line slope just like the standard calls for. And then the control structure installation was done with a backhoe. We put this in, and we wanted the pitchfork to go both ways, but the way the field was oriented, we needed it to go one direction, or we would have had to push water back uphill. So it was going to be difficult. So logistically, we had to put the pitchfork in where it just went one way. But in theory, you could do it both directions and get twice as much treatment. So the backflow valve is another important part of this, and this is just a one-way valve. So when the water goes out to the dispersion line, it can't come back. Once it goes there, it's just a little rubber flap, and I got a picture of it in this next slide. It's in the bottom left corner of that photograph, just a one-way valve. Water can go out, but it can't come back. Because we've done a project down in southern Illinois, a saturated buffer project, and when the water table hit a certain elevation, we always had backflow. So it looked like we were getting inputs of water, say of 100 gallons per minute, but our outflow would be 150. We're like, how's this? We're creating water. And it's those lateral dispersion lines are just behaving like typical field tile. They're draining water. And that saturated area along the stream has a lot of water in it, so it can contribute a lot of water. So, like I said, we also had that shutoff valve on the outermost leg of that pitchfork to shut it off so you could get in and do field operations. Both of these valves are removable. We can take them out and clean them, because that was one of the thoughts. If we're pushing water out all the time that has fine sediment in it, how are we going to ever clean this out? So we can pull that valve, 2-3 days and let that system flush out. We also had some field days associated with this project. So we had one day of installation, and then we also had one at SIU last summer to follow up on some of the findings. We do routine sampling, so every time we visit the site, we'll sample the outlets, the two watershed or the tile outlets, and then we also are trying to do storm sampling. So we're chasing some of the bigger events to see what's happening, what's getting pushed out during these storm flows. Same type of setup at the WASCOB site. We have two ISCOs, one on the inlet, one on the outlet to see what's coming in versus what's going out. Sampling 24 bottles over different times. And preliminary data show that the outflow of these two tiles on a per acre basis are relatively similar, right? Even though one's draining a lot more water, this one, they look like they're different when they're coming out, but when you put it on a per acre basis, it's about the same volume of water coming off each watershed. So on the tile outlets, the nutrients, relatively the same, coming out on both of them. One of the other things we're looking at is looking at monitoring wells. So you can see the red circles are where the monitoring wells were installed. We have one kind of control out 100 feet out into the field, so we're looking at groundwater out there, and then looking at it at 0 feet or wherever that transition from field to buffer is, and then one at halfway, and then one at the back of the buffer. So the one in the pitchfork has one on each tile dispersion line and one in between each tile dispersion line. We have two transects on each side. The data we're seeing from that so far is out in the field, it's around 6 to 8 milligrams per liter. And that standard buffer, the graph on the left, shows a successive reduction as you're going back. What's happening on that side, we think, is these lines are just consistently being flushed out. When we get to some of the flow data, you're going to see there's a lot of water coming in from those laterals. So we're not pushing it out like we are on the one with the backflow valve. And just my opinion, like you said, everybody's entitled to one. My opinion is that this backflow valve, in these situations where we have water tables that are fluctuating like they do in this, anytime it gets above that tile line, I think this saturated buffer needs to have a backflow valve installed. And here's why. Here's a typical storm event that we sampled, a couple inches of rain, and this is all going to depend on antecedent moisture, how much moisture is existing in the soil before this rain event occurs. But what we're seeing are incoming flows, and then we got dispersion line flows. That's the green arrow going out. So we're somewhere in between 15 and 16 gallons per hour per acre going out during both of these storm events. You can see the incoming values are very different. 209 versus, I can't read that, 80. So the outflows are reduced in this pitchfork design with the backflow valve. If you look at the standard buffer without the backflow valve, this is what we saw down south. Same thing. You've got 55 gallons coming in. These dispersion lines are contributing 36 gallons per hour per acre. So we're generating water again. So this nitrogen's not getting pushed out. It's coming back. So in these periods of high flow, these things aren't functioning like we hope they are. So storm-based DRP loads, you actually see an increase in the export in the standard buffer over what the inputs are, decrease in the pitchfork design. Same thing with nitrate. You see an increase, and because that's where more water's coming in versus that 15 or 16 gallons always going out. So this is what's driving the loads in terms of the export. So our preliminary findings for this, same type of, kind of what we hope to see. This backflow valve is working. The pitchfork design is treating about, there's about 11 pounds per acre a year of nitrate coming off, when DRP loads are relatively low, just 1/10 of a pound. And then during storm events, we're actually seeing this water go the wrong way in the standard buffer, going out in the pitchfork design. So, like I said earlier, these data are very preliminary for both studies. This is all going to change as we get the pollinators that we did plant in the buffer, that's the one thing I didn't mention. The farmer wanted to add some pollinators, so our buffer is a 7-way mix of pollinator species. And as that stuff starts transpiring and taking up water, assimilating nitrogen, I expect those well volumes to go down. I expect that to dry up quite a bit. So really, we've just looked at this fallow time of the year. So with new data coming in, we hope to see these trends shifting over time. And our grad students, look, the rock stars just showed up right at the end of the show. So here they are. So I'd like to acknowledge the Nutrient Research and Education Council, Illinois Farm Bureau, USDA, NRCS for designing both of these projects, Land Improvement Contractors America for help installing the saturated buffer and orchestrating all that. And then Mary, she just got me those sweet aerial photographs from the drone. What we plan on doing in the future on this is we've developed kind of a partnership, a saturated buffer partnership with these different groups, and we plan to install a new buffer every year for the next 5 years and kind of tweak some of these designs and see what's really working. Because if you look at saturated buffers in these tiled areas, all these sites don't meet the requirements for the standards. The organic matters levels aren't high enough. The saturated hydraulic conductivity is not fast enough. So this backflow valve may be an answer to some of those problems, may be more applicable in more areas. So with that, I'll take any questions.